In the year 2000, Iran had a bigger economy than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Turkey, bigger than the UAE. Let that sit for a second. Today, all three of those countries have economies more than 3 times the size of Iran's. No war caused that, no invasion, no single catastrophic event. What happened was slower, quieter, and in many ways more destructive than any missile strike. When the news covered Iran's war with Israel in 2025, the story was framed the same way it always is. Military hardware, geopolitics, nuclear sites, the drama of two nations on the edge. But here is what the coverage largely skipped. By the time the first strike happened, Iran's economy was already in freefall. The war did not break the system was already broken. The war just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. To understand how that happens to a country, you need to understand a few things about how Iran's economy actually worked, or more accurately, how it stopped working. Start with the currency. In 2018, $1 US cost you about 40,000 Iranian rials. That was already the result of years of pressure and mismanagement. But then sanctions tightened, and the rial began falling in a way that stopped looking like a crisis and started looking like a verdict. By early 2025, $1 cost 800,000 rials. Then the war happened. After the war, $1 cost over 1.6 million rials. As of early 2026, the exchange rate crossed 1.75 million rials to the dollar, making the rial officially the least valuable currency on the planet. That is not a typo. The rial, the currency of a country sitting on some of the world's largest oil reserves, became worth less per unit than almost any piece of paper on Earth. Now here is where it gets interesting, because most people assume this was about sanctions. And sanctions matter, they matter enormously. But sanctions were the accelerant, not the fire. The fire was structural. Iran's government had been running budget deficits for years, spending more than it earned, and plugging the gap the way governments always do when they run out of options. They borrowed from the central bank, which is a polite way of saying they printed money. More money chasing the same amount of goods, you already know what that does. Inflation ran at around 44% in 2022, then 2023, then 2024, when it was supposed to ease, it clawed back up. By late 2025, food inflation alone had crossed 60%. Bread prices nearly doubled. Fruit costs surged over 70%. And here's the part that's easy to miss in the numbers. Iran's poorest households spend 42% of their income on food. When food inflates at 60%, it does not hit everyone equally. It hits the bottom hardest and leaves the top relatively untouched. Every price spike is quietly a transfer of wealth from people who can least afford it to anyone with assets denominated in dollars, gold, or property. One Iranian economist called it exactly what it was, a tax on the poor. Then there is the oil problem. You might assume a country with Iran's oil reserves could always fall back on that, and Iran did try, but under US sanctions, finding buyers became an elaborate shadow operation. Iran built a ghost fleet of tankers. Ships changed names, changed flags, performed ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean just to disguise the origin of the cargo. By mid-2025, 52 million barrels of Iranian crude were sitting in floating storage near Malaysia. Not because there were no sellers, because there were delivery bottlenecks, Chinese refinery quotas, and buyers who didn't want the legal exposure. Meanwhile, the government had built a budget on exporting 1.85 million barrels per day at $67 a barrel. The IMF projected the real figure would be closer to 1.1 million barrels. That gap between what the government assumed and what reality delivered is roughly where the fiscal crisis lives. And then there is where the money actually went. This is the part Iranian citizens have been angrier about than perhaps anything else. While the government was printing money to cover salaries, while workers were seeing their purchasing power halved, while nurses were leaving the country at a rate of 3,000 per year, Iran was simultaneously funding military operations across 4 countries: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. Proxy networks that cost real money, money that didn't build a hospital or a school or a power grid inside Iran. In February 2025, power started going out across Iranian cities for 3 to 4 hours every day, not in wartime, before the war. Rolling blackouts in the capital of a country with massive natural gas reserves because the infrastructure had been neglected for so long that it simply couldn't keep up. 50,000 students were leaving Iran per year. Youth unemployment was hovering around 22%. The labor force participation rate had fallen to 41%, meaning more than half of working-age Iranians had effectively given up looking. In November 2024, an Iranian state newspaper warned the regime of an impending revolution by the poor. The bombs came 7 months later. Here is the uncomfortable question that the war coverage never really asked. If you were running a country with 40+% inflation, a currency in freefall, blackouts in your capital, and a population where over half of people under 40 are either unemployed or not looking, what does military escalation actually buy you? One theory is that external enemies are always useful when internal problems become too visible. Another is that the regime genuinely believed deterrence required projection. A third is simpler, that institutions in survival mode do not plan strategically, they react. What we do know is this: Iran's economy did not collapse because of the war. The collapse was well underway. What the war changed was the narrative. Suddenly, there was something to blame other than decades of fiscal mismanagement, currency printing, and capital flight. Official data shows roughly $20 billion left Iran in 2024 alone. In the months just before the war started, another $9 billion followed. When the people with options are already leaving, that is not a country preparing for a fight. That is a country that have already decided something was over. The question is just which part.